So as we wander around this beautiful period townhouse in South London, I'm just going to have a little chat about some of the history we've discovered about the house. Records show that Barkham Terrace was built in 1842 by Henry Hurd of Castle Street and Anne Hewitt of the New Kent Road. Originally there were 18 three-storey houses, with the Upton Baptist Chapel in the centre. It was named after Edward Barkham, an 18th century benefactor of Bethlehem Hospital, also known as Bethlem or Bedlam, which was opposite the house at the time, in what is now the Imperial War Museum. Initially the house was known as 6 Barkham Terrace, but by 1881 that changed to 66 Lambeth Road. At some point it changed back to Barkham Terrace, but using a different numbering system. We've traced the occupants of this house back to 1851, the first census after the house was built, through to 1920, during which time it was lived in by the same family. In 1851, it was occupied by Anne Hewitt, a widow who describes herself as a gentlewoman, and this is the Anne Hewitt who was involved in building the 18 houses. We can't really be sure how or why Anne was involved in building the houses, but she doesn't seem to have owned them. We found records of her renting the house from Bethlehem Hospital, and the trustees sold the houses in 1929. But we have found plenty of other information about her. Born in 1803, she married William in 1922 and had a total of 9 children, 7 boys and 2 girls. William was captain of Her Majesty's ship Fairy, which sank off the Suffolk coast in a storm in November 1840, killing everyone on board. Fairy was a survey vessel, mapping shoals, quicksands and sunken rocks around the coast to help protect shipping. Sadly, Anne's brother and her eldest son were also on board at the time. She was granted a pension of £100 per annum by the Royal Navy, plus £16 for each of their 8 remaining children, and she also had £60 to £70 per annum from William's estate, which all totalled the equivalent of around £30,000 a year in today's money. Not a huge amount. In 1841, there was a heartfelt appeal for public generosity to help her and other family members of those lost on HMS Fairy. The other person named in the building of the houses, Henry Hurd of Castle Street, seems to have been a bricklayer. Did Anne help fund the building? If so, why and how? We really don't know. But whatever her connection, she lived in this particular one of the houses along with various other family members for the remainder of her life. From 1851 to 1881, the census reports Anne living with an ever-changing group, including some of her children, 2 of her unmarried sisters, Tabitha and Catherine, and lodgers, including a German astronomer. She also had a servant. In 1851 and 61, this was Alice Blake from Gloucestershire, but by 1871 a new servant had taken over, Ellen Jetton from Portsmouth. Anne died in October 1888 and is buried at Brompton Cemetery. Her probate records show her estate to be valued at £2,581, 18 shillings and 9pence, which was left to her 5th son, Charles. That equates to about £343,000 in today's money. After her death, her 2 sisters remained at the house along with the servant Ellen. Catherine died in January 1892, so by 1901 it was just Tabitha and Ellen living in the house. Then Tabitha died in April 1907, aged 95, but in 1911 the house was still in the family, as it was home to George Babb Hewitt, Anne's 6th son. He was retired on a pension from the Indian Navy. And Ellen was still there as the house servant. By this point she'd been with the family for over 40 years. And he also had a younger servant, Mary Jane Boniface, who was 27 and came from Midhurst in Sussex. George was made captain by order of the King in February 1920 and lived here until his death in April that year. He left his effects of £22,418 and 5 shillings, which is just over £1 million in today's money, to Isabel Laura Hewitt, a spinster who we think was probably a great niece of his. He had no children of his own. We've got no more records of the house until it entered a very different stage of its existence. That story started to develop in the street in 1907, when the Institute of Trained Nurses of the Order of Our Lady of Consolation secured 2 of the houses. In 1929, the Catholic Nursing Institute got a mortgage of £20,000 at 5.5% and bought the freehold site of all 18 houses, excluding the chapel, for £30,000. That's the equivalent of £2 million today. That was bought from the Bethlehem trustees. At that point, 3 houses were used, but in 1932 another house became available and was incorporated. The others still had tenants. In 1939, the west end of the terrace was demolished to make way for a purpose-built hospital. At this time, numbers 60 to 68 Lambeth Road, including this one, number 66, were one dwelling, housing 26 nurses from the Catholic Nursing Institute. And we understand that one of those nurse nuns still lives in the road. So, by 1939, most, if not all, of the street was being used as a hospital, and during World War II, 21 beds were under the control of St Thomas's Hospital. In 1940, a high-explosive bomb demolished half of the hospital building and severely damaged the chapel. The damage was fixed in 1951, completing the new 70-bed hospital in December 1952. The chapel was too badly damaged and was demolished in the same year. The institute closed in 1984, but the western part remains a hospital to this day, using the 1950s buildings. We're not sure when the eastern part of the street was returned to domestic houses, but when the current owners bought this house in 2013, it was in a very poor state of repair, so it had apparently been empty for some time. Before the Imperial War Museum, before the Bethlehem Hospital, this piece of land, St George's Field, already had an interesting story to tell. The Dog and Duck Tavern was built here in the 17th century. In the 18th century its gardens were used as a spa, but by the 1770s, with spas no longer fashionable, it declined into a rowdy location for concerts. In 1788 the Times wrote about the renewal of the tavern's licence. This pleasantly situated stop has been improved at a very enormous expense by its present proprietor, who has laid out the gardens with peculiar neatness and refreshed them by a large canal. Here it was thought the youth of both sexes met too numerous and too often for the benefit of their morals, and a strong party was formed to annihilate the place. But the general idea of sensible men was that the proclamation only gave an opportunity for the long pent-up malice of a certain junto in the parish, who envied industry its long-earned reward, to busy forth on this man's head and at once crush all his hopes providing handsomely for his family. This is one measure they effected by shutting up his doors on a Sunday evening and preventing him the liberty that every other victualler enjoyed of selling tea, wine, etc., as if his house and gardens were more offensive to morality than those of other people. It certainly was true that the beauties of this place, the variety of the company and the gaiety of the music drew together a vast concourse of people, but there was neither a private room to commit fornication nor late hours to induce inebriety. The only complaint, in truth, was that the music invited, the company charmed, and that, as is ever the case in all places of public amusement, girls of the town crowded here. But eventually, after protracted legal disputes, they lost their battle, and the tavern was closed in 1799 for exactly the reasons mentioned 11 years previously. For a few years the building was then used by Thomas Boddington's School for the Indigent Blind, that's impoverished blind, that charity that still exists today under the name Seeability. It was demolished in 1812 when the Bethlehem Hospital was built on the site, between 1812 and 1815, with later additions during the 1800s. The extra wings added were then removed in 1930, and the surviving central section became the Imperial War Museum as we see it today.